corporate strategy has, to a certain extent, harmed art. And by that I mean commercial art forms such as books, music, and television, movies. I'm primarily, though, going to focus on books and movies here because that's what I know best. And I will be talking about art as a commodity here because art, at the end of the day, is a commercial commodity. It's not more rarefied than any other product. When it's a very good product and I love it, but it is a product. Here's the well-duh part. The majority of big studios and publishing houses are corporations. And legally speaking, a corporation must act in the interests of its shareholders. The sole goal of that legal entity is to make profit for the people who have invested in it. And a large portion of those shareholders that are investing in these companies come from other industries. And across the majority of industries that are out there, the prevailing corporate strategy, and I know across different industries and even across different companies, corporate strategies do differ quite significantly, but in a very broad general trend sense, companies want to decide what to do in the future based on what has worked in the past. This is because the bigger companies get, the more risk averse they become because they have more shareholders, they have more, top-down corporate pressure, and they have more to lose. This strategy works swimmingly in the majority of industries, generally speaking. If you sell toilet paper one way with a certain level of thickness and a certain price and a certain retailer and certain this and certain that, and that has worked for the past 20 years, it's probably going to work for the next 20 years and for the next 20 years after that. People's tastes in toilet paper are pretty simple, generally don't evolve that much. You can rely on past precedent to a very, very large extent when you're selling toilet paper. Art, however, works a bit differently because people's tastes in art evolve and people get oversaturated with the same thing and tired of seeing the same thing again and again. If you get the same exact roll of toilet paper again and again, if it's a good roll of toilet paper, you don't care. You're not going to get tired of having the same toilet paper. You're not going to wish that the next roll of toilet paper felt like sandpaper or whatever. Even consumers who like what the predominant art form is like, at least when they first get into it, even people who are into it for a very good while and buy a lot of very similar art products, different movies, different books, etc., that follow the same high-yield commercial themes, eventually they're going to start looking for something that completely breaks all those rules and breaks out of that mold simply because they've seen so much of that thing. Even if they like it, eventually they're going to look for something that's specifically not that if they just get too much of it. And I'm probably not really opening your eyes or blowing your mind here. I really doubt that the majority of my listeners out there were not aware before watching this video that people like a little bit of variety in their art, that people like to see something new and unique. However, this common sense realization doesn't enter into the minds of corporate executives. Except, actually, I would imagine in a lot of cases it does. Because, corporate execs aren't complete idiots, at least in the majority of cases. You don't get to be that high up if you're a complete and utter dunce. However, implementing these common sense ideas becomes a bit more difficult when you remember the legal structure of a corporation. A corporation is not owned or controlled by any one individual or small cohort that can just come together and decide, we're going to make this new thing. There are a bajillion different shareholders, some with more influence, some with less. The big influential shareholders vote and decide on a board of directors who answer directly to the interests of the shareholders because, as I said, most important point here, a corporation must act in the economic interests of its shareholders at all times. That means that if you gamble on artistic merit, or I like this story, or something that you can't go into a boardroom and numerically justify and explain this new investment in these kinds of stories, this new strategy, this new deal we're making with this or that artist is going to work because X. If you can't explain that, then it's very, very difficult to get a decision through. Because that decision is risky, it may or may not end up in the interests of the shareholders. If you make a decision and it ends up being a bad decision, but you could at least explain beforehand, this is why we reasonably thought that this would end up being in the interests of the shareholders, then you can at least cover your asses. But if you're like, I think this story will resonate with the audience, not because stories like this have resonated with the audience in the past, but because it's simply a good story. It's new, it's out of the box, I like the way the author's thinking, whatever. You can't really justify that in a boardroom in the same way. And in a risk-averse corporation, any decision that you're going to make is going to need to be justifiably in the interests of the shareholders. And how do you explain and justify that this decision, this new rights acquisition to this or that story or whatever, will be in the interests of the shareholders? Well, you look to the past. You look what's selling now and what has sold before. You can't look to the future and be like, I think this story will build its own audience on its own merits because it's just out of the box and coming up with something new. You just can't get that argument through. The only thing you can rely on is numerical, hard and fast data. And since we only have data on the past and the present, the only decisions you can justify are what we were doing before or what we're doing now. It's very hard to justify to a corporation a new out-of-the-box artistic decision or direction. Thus, what might seem like absolute, complete, and utter common sense to a regular person. You know, all of these Marvel movies are just the same old slop, over and over. They're trying to recycle the humor that worked in Guardians of the Galaxy in 37 new movies, and it's not working because people already got that in Guardians of the Galaxy, and they don't want any more of it, they want something new. This kind of stuff that would occur clear as day to a regular, completely smooth-brained, normal individual probably does occur to the corporate execs, but they can't get it through because of the way big businesses work, because they're so risk-averse. And ironically, just doing what you've always done before is a very risky decision in art because your consumers are fickle, picky beings and the ground is constantly shifting underneath you because people get bored so easily. So while it is actually technically kind of riskier at the end of the day and doesn't really work long term, corporations will cling to their last dying breaths to doing what has worked.